First, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I don't know if I've ever gotten an introduction quite that effusive, so I appreciate it. I also really appreciate the invitation. Like Professor Tsutsui said, I graduated from here in 2000. I have sat here many times listening to noon lectures. Actually, more of them were over at Lane Hall before this building was built, but it's very nice to be able to have an opportunity to be on the other side, and like he said, to have two of the members of my dissertation committee sitting right in front of me to listen to some of this work. I appreciate you all coming out to listen. Like Professor Tsutsui said, this is going to be about single mothers and poverty. I think this is a topic that's probably broadly interesting. I will try to make it as interesting as I can. I don't know the local norms. I'm certainly happy to take questions as we go. Otherwise, we'll leave some time at the end for a Q&A session. I will try to minimize the technical aspects and spend a little bit more time talking about the background, provide a little bit of an overview of what's going on with respect to family change and poverty in Japan, on the hopes that this isn't something that is already very familiar to all of you guys. So having said that, one more thing. I should note that my co-author on this is Sawako Shirahase, who is a professor of sociology at University of Tokyo. And interestingly enough, I met her for the first time here at the ISR building when I was a graduate student, and she was here as a visiting scholar. Finally, 15 years later or something, we decided that we would write a paper together on a topic of shared interest. So that's that. Let me just start by running through the research questions real quickly before I spend the bulk of the time sort of giving you a little bit of the background, trying to set things up a little bit better. The really fundamental motivating question for this paper, this project, is to try to assess the extent to which the official poverty measures, the measures that we get, say, from the OECD or from the Japanese government, that tell us what proportion of single mothers are in poverty in Japan, to what extent are those an overstatement of the actual economic disadvantage faced by these people, because that doesn't account for the large proportion of single mothers who co-reside with parents. Okay? I'll talk more about this later, but that's really the number one motivating question. Another question that's interesting along those same lines is when we think about trends in poverty. So I'm going to show you that poverty has gone up over time. We know, or we think, that one of the reasons that the rise in poverty has taken place is a result of the growth in the proportion of the population that are single mothers. Okay, the rise in single motherhood, the rise in divorce, and the formation of single parent families, we expect, and I will document, has contributed to the rise in poverty. What I'm interested in here in thinking about living arrangements is to what extent has the relatively high prevalence of co-residence with parents perhaps mitigated the impact of the rise in single parent families. Okay, I'll talk more about the US research along these lines to maybe give a little bit more background on that, but that's number two. And number three is in terms, we think about the sources of income. If we think about poverty, having income below the poverty level, we can think about that being a result of different types of income that you receive. Either it's because you don't earn a lot, either it's because you don't receive a lot of public income transfers, government transfers, or perhaps it may be due to intrafamilial transfers. And what I want to see here is to what extent these three sources of income, earnings, public income support, and intergenerational co-residence and shared income, contribute to limit poverty among single mothers in Japan. So that's really where we're going. As a demographer, I'm going to be using large-scale survey data. I'll talk more about that later. And doing what we call sort of counterfactual analyses, sort of saying what would have happened if X percent of single mothers in Japan didn't live with their parents. These kinds of questions, sort of creating calculations for counterfactual scenarios to evaluate sort of intuitively the extent to which these things may be important. I'll explain that all more later. So here's where I'm going to go. A little bit of overview on poverty and family change in Japan, like I said. Talk a little bit at a general level about the relationships between living arrangements, intergenerational co-residence, and familial support income, shared income. talk a little bit about single mothers in Japan. What do we know about single mothers in Japan? I would argue probably not as much as we should. So hopefully you'll all leave here at least with a better understanding of what single mothers in Japan look like in terms of a range of relevant characteristics. I'll talk about the data, and then I'll present my results, and then hopefully we'll have a good discussion afterwards. So this is just to give you a little background. Trends in poverty in Japan. The black line is the proportion of the population that lives below the poverty line between 1985 and 2009. This is the official figure for Japan, increased from about 12% to about 16%. The red line is children, okay? So bottom line, increasing poverty in Japan, but you guys knew that already. This is really interesting information in terms of setting up the focus. Why do I care so much about single mothers? The black and the red line I just showed you, the overall and the kids, these are the same lines. I just changed the scale of the vertical axis. The green line is the proportion of single mothers in poverty. So this is the 10 to 16% I just showed you. Those are single mothers hovering between 50 and 60%. So over half of single mother households are below the poverty line. Okay, and just as a brief aside, there are different ways of measuring poverty. When I talk about poverty, I'm talking about sort of the international standard relative measure of poverty. Having a household, being in a household whose household income is below 1/2 of the median household income for that country. Okay, so that's the definition of poverty I'm going to be using. So how does Japan compare to other countries? I think this is where people get surprised. I don't know if you'll be surprised. I was surprised when I first saw this and thought hard about this. In terms of overall poverty, if we look at the 34 countries in the OECD today and look at recent data, 2009, 2010, Japan is number 6 in terms of the overall poverty rate. I think we don't typically view Japan as a high poverty country, but in relative terms, it is. In terms of child poverty, they do pretty well. Japan does pretty well. Sort of middle of the pack, around the OECD average. And I showed you that green line. In terms of single parent families, number 2. Let me show you some figures right now that are pretty striking. These are all of the OECD countries here on the vertical axis here, ordered from the lowest rate of 2-parent family poverty. Denmark down to Israel, highest to lowest. The dark bars, the dark black or the dark red, in this case, are for single parent families. Okay, it's not ordered by single parent families. But you can see here, there are 2 countries that stand out drastically from the rest of the pack. Luxembourg and Japan. The figures fluctuate from year to year. Luxembourg isn't always the number 1. Japan has always been up there, at least in the past 10 years or so, in terms of having one of the highest rates of single-parent poverty in the OECD, or in developed countries. There are only 2 countries that are over 50%. So this is what really got me interested in this subject to start. This really striking level of poverty among single-parent families in Japan. I wasn't aware of this at all. A little bit of background about trends in single-parent families. 1993 to 2005, I should probably update with 2010 census data. The red line is the trend in the number of single-mother households. So single mothers living with children, what we might call lone mother households. You can see a pretty steady increase, about a 50% increase over a relatively short period of time, only 12 years. It hasn't actually declined there in 2005. We're just using different data sources. The bottom line is there's a pretty sharp increase in the number of single mother families. Single father families, much less common, much less change over time. Okay? Why? Simple answer, divorce. In the US and in many other of the OECD countries where there are high proportions of single parent families, a lot of this has come about via an increase in non-marital childbearing. I mean, certainly that's the case in the US. You know, certainly if we looked at US data, that would be one of the primary drivers of the rise in single parent families. In Japan, this is like the one place in Japanese family dynamics where Japan really remains unique compared to a lot of other countries, and the very, very low level of non-marital childbearing. Okay? It's masked by a huge rise in what we used to call shotgun weddings here. So there's a lot of non-marital conceptions, but not a lot of non-marital childbearing. But that's an aside. That's a different series of projects I'm working on. This basically shows the rise in divorce. The total is the number of divorces over time. The key thing to note here is that gray, red, gray, those are the ones that involve children. About 60% of divorces involve kids. Red are the cases in which mothers get sole custody of the kids. So about 80% of divorces that involve kids, mothers get sole custody. This is where this rise in single mother families comes from. Okay, joint custody is almost nil in Japan, and very rarely do fathers get sole custody of children. So this is the background. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this one. It's the same thing, basically. And I don't know if I said it earlier, but I should say, please ask questions. I did say that, okay. A little bit of background. You know, as somebody who's interested in these things in Japan, working in the US, a lot of the inspiration comes from talking to colleagues who are doing related research on the US, reading related research on the US. There's a ton of work on poverty and single parenthood, changing family structure in the United States. Maybe some of you guys are familiar with it. Certainly it's written up in the papers quite a bit. From that work, we know that there is a very well-documented relationship between the rise in single-parent families in the US as a result of both divorce and non-marital childbearing, and the rise in income inequality and poverty in this country. Okay, so we know that in the context of the US. Another thing that we increasingly are aware of, this is, I think, an emerging area of research. I don't think there's enough that's really been done on this. I have a close colleague that I'm working with at Wisconsin, Tim Smeating. He and I are working on related issues. But there's a growing recognition that, at least in the United States, for low-income single mothers, an increasingly important component of their economic well-being or economic resources is intrafamilial transfers, particularly those received as a result of co-residence, shared housing, income sharing via co-residence with parents or others. This is particularly important in the context of changing welfare policies, where there's a major reduction in public income support. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but the same thing is happening in Japan. An emphasis on employment for single mothers, reduction in welfare, emphasis on employment. Exactly the same thing in Japan, except perhaps even more extreme than in the US case. And limited employment opportunities. In the US, this is particularly driven by selection. A lot of the single mothers are those with the most limited sort of what we might call human capital or earnings potential. In Japan, it has a lot to do with the fact that all mothers, not just single mothers, have discontinuous work histories. It's hard to get back into the labor force. It's hard to balance work and family. So all of these are relevant for understanding this increase in what we think of as the importance of shared resources, shared income via co-residence for low-income single moms in the United States. Luckily for me and others interested in this topic, this is I don't want to say completely unexplored, but a largely unexplored area in the Japanese context. I'm familiar with a few studies on this. If you guys know of any others, I would be very, very eager to know of them. I think it's an area that we don't really know much about. So just a little bit of background to give you, I told you, if nothing else, take away from this talk a better understanding of what single mothers look like in Japan. There are several very distinctive characteristics that I think are important for understanding what we're interested in here. One of them is the very high rates of labor force participation. So not only do single mothers in Japan have the highest rates of poverty in the OECD, but they have among the highest rates of labor force participation as well. About 90%, 85–90% of single mothers are employed. That's much higher than in a lot of other countries. There are some other countries, Mexico and others, that are similar, but Japan stands out. And again, this is a reflection of the policies that I mentioned earlier. Despite the fact that 85 or 90% are employed, they have on average, single mothers have on average very low earnings. I've already talked about limited labor market opportunities, the difficulties of work-family balance. This is not relevant only to single mothers, but relevant to all mothers in Japan. I mean, you guys have been seeing Prime Minister Abe's new policy initiatives to increase the number of women in the labor force and promote work-family balance as a means to do that. This is relevant here as well. I've already mentioned the discontinuous work trajectories. Here's another interesting sort of factoid that I find very interesting. We all know about the high proportions of Japanese mothers who drop out of the labor force prior to the birth of their first child. I don't know if you know what proportion it is. It's roughly 2/3 to 3/4, and that hasn't changed for like 25 or 30 years. So still a large proportion of mothers drop out of the labor force. For those mothers who subsequently divorce and become single mothers, it's very hard to re-enter the labor market in the kind of job that would allow for non-poverty wages. Selection is another issue. I've already mentioned the US context where we see that single mothers are disproportionately represented by people, women who have lower levels of education, more limited earnings capacity. There hasn't been a lot of research on this in the US, but in other work we've been looking at educational differences in divorce in Japan. And it's pretty clear that there's a very strong negative gradient. In other words, divorces, as in the US, highly concentrated among women with a high school degree or less in Japan, and men by extension. But there's the same kind of selection process here. So to the extent that we think that women with lower levels of education upon becoming single mothers are disadvantaged in the labor market, this is another reason for the low levels of earnings. In terms of the public transfer component, I mentioned that this is not, the Japanese government is not generous to families in general, and it's definitely not generous to single mothers in particular. There are three sources of public transfer in income for single mothers. There's the child allowance, which everybody with children gets. It's about 10,000 yen per kid, $100 per kid per month, or thereabouts. A child rearing allowance for single mothers, which is about 40,000 yen, 400 some odd dollars per month for the first kid, and then increments for additional children. So not much. And then public assistance, or what we might call welfare here. Very hard to qualify, and interestingly for our purposes, one of the criteria for qualifying for public assistance is documentation of having no family members capable of providing support for you. So that's important here in terms of thinking about the role of co-residence with parents. I mentioned this bit about custody and the fact that women are most likely to get full custody, mothers are most likely to get full custody of their children. Joint custody, that little tiny gray bar at the top, very, very uncommon, unlike the US. And I don't have good data on this. Maybe there are some of you who actually study this, I don't know. But at least anecdotally, a big difference in terms of post-divorce paternal involvement in the lives of children is a sort of complete disassociation of fathers with their children from a dissolved marriage. When we say that mothers have sole custody, we really mean sole custody in terms of all kinds of support financially and otherwise. And then the motivation for this is a recognition that there's a high proportion of single mothers who live with parents and are thus potentially able to access the shared income or other kinds of resources that may mitigate these other economic disadvantages that they face. So actually there is no survey that, well, there hasn't been any single survey that actually asks single mothers, actually it's been hard to identify single mothers in surveys, but there hasn't been a survey that's asked single mothers, who do you live with? So there have been a lot of, we've made a lot of efforts to sort of indirectly get at this, and we've looked at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different surveys from the early 2000s to try to get different estimates of the proportion of single moms who live with their parents. You can see it's pretty consistent at about 1/4 to 1/3. We have new surveys that I'll talk about maybe at the end where we're actually directly asking and we get similar figures. So think roughly 1/4. So a lot don't live with their parents and they're what we might call lone mother families, but there is quite a high proportion of people who do live with their parents. We've done comparisons across other countries. The only country that's even close is the US. Surprisingly, Korea and other places where you might expect to see high proportions of single moms living with parents, not so much. But Japan stands out as the highest. If we think about the measure of poverty and we look at those OECD figures and we think, you know, my goodness, you know, Japan is a country in which single mothers look like they're faring horribly relative to other countries. It could be very misleading given that those figures are based on single mother households. They don't include single mothers who live with their parents. They don't include these 30% of single mothers. To the extent that we're ignoring these, our measures, the official measures of poverty that we use to talk about the relative well-being of single mothers or other groups across countries may not be giving us what we think it's giving us. And that's really the motivation for this study. To what extent does this matter for our assessment of how single mothers are doing in Japan, both in absolute and relative terms? That's really where we're coming from. So those are the research questions again. You guys all remember them perfectly from the beginning, so I'm not going to go over them again. I just wanted to reiterate them here to lead into the motivation. I said this would lead in nicely. This is what I just said. We tend to take these OECD figures kind of blindly. Wow, Japan looks pretty bad. How does it look if we really look at single mothers, not at single mother households? That's the bottom line. I'm a sociologist. I'm interested in understanding the extent to which we can understand intergenerational co-residence, family arrangements, family-provided support as an adaptation to social change. There's a large body of literature that talks about the ways in which families have used intergenerational co-residence to respond to a range of different social and economic changes, including the rise of female labor force participation, AIDS epidemic, population aging, a range of different things. Here, the social change is single parenthood. We want to think about the extent to which we can understand intergenerational co-residence as a kind of family adaptation. And from a policy perspective, I mentioned that the Japanese government is very interested in scaling back to the extent possible the amount of money being provided to the rising population of single mothers. I don't have time to talk about it now, but there's been a lot of debate around implementation of term limits, reductions in thresholds for receiving maximum benefits, a lot of efforts to pull back. So from a policymaker's perspective, surely it's very important to be able to quantify the extent to which shared income via co-residence actually does matter. There's a lot of government extolling of the virtues of the extended family and the extent to which the family provides support for family members in need. Our effort is one to quantify the extent to which that actually matters. So, getting into the meat of the analysis here. Professor Tsutsui mentioned that there are a lot of really interesting data available in Japan. Yoshia here will remember when I came here that there was no such thing. The access to individual level data, rich government data, no way. It was off limits. That's completely changed, I'm happy to say, over the past 20 years. We're going to be working with a survey that I'm calling the Comprehensive Survey of Living Conditions, the Kokumin Seikatsu Kiso Chosa, which is a very large-scale survey. Every 3 years they do a really large-scale survey that collects information on income. This is where the actual official poverty figures from Japan are derived from this survey. So we're using the same data that the government uses to calculate poverty rates. We've got a large sample of 42,000 mothers of minor children. The weighted sample is quite large, as you'll see. The key things for our purposes are that we have information on income from all household members. So we can isolate the income of single mothers living with their parents from the parents' income, which is going to be critical, okay? And we have information on multiple income sources. So I talked about earnings versus public support income, for example. I can identify how many, man yen a woman gets from her own earnings versus how much she gets from public transfers, the three sources I talked about. So that's the data that we're going to be using. These are some figures. The black line is the one I've already showed you. That goes with the right vertical axis. That's the proportion of single moms in poverty. This is the proportion of mothers who are not married. That's on the left axis. Went up from about 5% to 10%. So in a relatively short period of 20 years, the proportion of mothers who are unmarried doubled. Okay? It's not super high in comparative perspective, but it's not low either. I've already showed these. I already showed the green line. That's the single mothers living alone, the lone mother households. These are the two groups of married mothers: black, co-residing with parents; red, living alone, nuclear families. About 10%, no change over time. The key thing to note here, two things to note here. This gray line in the middle, this is the poverty rate for single mothers living with other people, living with their parents. So two things to note. It's lower. It's about half of the measure for lone mother households. So clearly the answer to our first question is going to be it matters. The official figures are going to overstate poverty among single mothers. The question will be how much? So that's point number one. Point number two to take from this is high. 30% of unmarried mothers who are co-residing with parents are still in households whose household income falls below the poverty line. So clearly, as in the US, single mothers who are co-residing with parents are in many cases co-residing with parents who themselves are not in particularly very good economic circumstances. I can tell you more about that later, but sorry. This was really quite striking to us and to the reviewers of the paper as well. So basically what we're going to do here is we're going to recalculate the poverty rate by putting the single mothers living with parents back into the calculation. They're going to be in both the numerator and the denominator. What does it look like when we do that? Looks like this. The red line is the official figure based on lone mother households. This is the figure I just showed you. It was gray, and the other one should keep the colors consistent. Sorry. Single mothers living with parents. The dotted line is the recalculated poverty figure where we calculate the poverty rate for all single mothers. So it's lower, of course. It's about 12 to 20% lower, depending on the year that you look at, than the official figure. But it's still 50%. Okay? So those are the two things to take away from this. A, it matters for comparison, and B, they're still in pretty bad shape overall, even if we account for the fact that a substantial proportion, or substantial maybe too much, a non-trivial minority of the single mothers are co-residing with others. To answer the questions about the extent to which potential changes in living arrangements may have mitigated the impact of the rise in single parent families on poverty, what we do is to calculate a series of counterfactual analyses, counterfactual figures. I'm not going to explain the equation, but basically what we've done is to express the poverty rate among mothers, as a function of living arrangements, marital status, and poverty conditional on marital status and living arrangements. So it's three things that make up the poverty rate. We can isolate the effects of each of those by recalculating the poverty rate when we hold one of them at its earlier levels constant. So in other words, we can ask, what if living arrangements hadn't changed since 1986? What would the trend in the poverty rate look like? What if that rise from 5% to 10% among single mothers, what if that hadn't taken place? What if the proportion of mothers who were unmarried stayed at 5%? What would the poverty trend look like? So that's kind of the logic underlying this. The black line is the trend in poverty among mothers. Went up from about 10% to 13%. The numbers aren't that large. That's a pretty large percentage increase, obviously. The red dotted line is what happens to the poverty rate when we hold living arrangements constant at its 1986 values. Nothing happens. Largely that's because living arrangements didn't change. So there's no evidence whatsoever that families maybe have responded to the increase in single parent families by increasingly living with their single parent daughter. There's no evidence of that. This is what happens when we hold marital status constant. So what if the rise in single parenthood hadn't taken place? This is what the poverty line would look like. Not so much here, but from the 1990s on, this actually explains most of the rise in poverty. If it had stayed the same, this is what the poverty rate in 2007 would have looked like. So pretty much the same. So at least recently, the rise in poverty is largely due to the rise in the prevalence of single mother families. This is the third component. I'm not going to spend much time on that. The takeaway from this is that living arrangements really haven't, in terms of trends in poverty, irrelevant. It's all about the increase in single mother families. So this is similar to what we've seen in the US, at least in earlier years. This is question number 3. Remember here, I'm interested in evaluating the relative importance of women's own, single mothers, own earnings, public transfer income, and shared income via co-residence. Okay? So I'm going to look at single moms living with their parents, or living alone, and living with their parents separately. And I'm going to calculate some counterfactual values of poverty, asking first, what would the poverty rate be if we took away all mothers' income? We're just going to remove all of their own earned income. They earn zero. What would the poverty rate be? So by comparing that counterfactual poverty rate with the actual poverty rate, we're able to get a sense, at least an intuitive sense, of the extent to which earnings limits poverty among single mothers. Okay? Similarly, we can say, what if public income transfers were eliminated? How much would the poverty rate among single mothers go up? To what extent does the child rearing allowance, the child allowance, mitigate poverty? Okay? I can talk a lot about this, some really interesting research on this if we can have time to talk about it later. Really fascinating stuff about the ineffectiveness of the government transfer policies in supporting single mothers in Japan. And third, what if we removed all of the shared income from parents that single mothers derive by living with their parents? What would the poverty rate look like? So you can think about it in another way. What if we sort of counterfactually kicked all of the single mothers out of their co-residential arrangements and forced them to become lone mothers? What would their poverty rate look like? Okay, so this is our sort of demographic approach to trying to quantify the extent to which these different types of income actually matter for understanding poverty among single moms, the high rates of poverty among single moms. The red you've already seen before. This is the poverty rate among women who are not single moms, who are not co-residing, lone mothers, about 60%. You already saw that. This is across 1995 to 2007. So it's an average of the trends I showed you before. For the co-resident single mothers, it's about half of that, 30%. So those are the figures you've already seen. What if we remove women's own earnings? You see that for those who are living on their own, the poverty rate shoots up to about 95%. So in other words, if we took away the earnings of single moms living on their own, almost all of them would be in poverty. Okay? So earnings is clearly important for this group. Really quite fascinating to us was the fact that if we took away women's own earnings here, obviously the levels are lower, but the poverty rate would nearly double. So again, despite the fact that they're living with their parents, their own earnings is important. If we took that away, those households, those women, the proportion in poverty would nearly double. So again, this tells us that the parents that they're living with aren't in particularly good economic circumstances themselves. What about public transfer income? This is interesting. So you'd think that this would be really relevant, but I've already primed you to think or realize that it's not. This is what the poverty rate would look like if we took away transfers to single moms, okay? About maybe a 5 or 6 percentage point increase. But basically, what this tells us is that public transfers don't do a heck of a lot to limit poverty among single mothers. They do a little bit, but they don't do that much, okay? And now to the core question, for these guys over here, how important is shared income via co-residence? What would the poverty rate actually look like if we hypothetically, counterfactually kicked them out of the household and made them become lone mothers? Looks like this. Boom. About 70% of them would be in poverty. So clearly, for this group of women, shared income via co-residence is the most important economic resource, the most important thing in terms of limiting poverty among this group. So a couple of one interesting thing to take away from this, 70% of these mothers would be in poverty if they were lone mothers, if we forced them to be lone mothers. Take a look at that compared to the actual poverty rate among lone mothers. It's higher. So this gives us some evidence of sort of what we might call negative selection into co-residence. In other words, like I sort of mentioned in the US, this is some evidence that maybe the women who are least capable of earning non-poverty wage on their own are the most likely to co-reside with parents. This is another thing that we found striking and interesting. What have we learned? Very quickly, we've learned a few things. Intergenerational co-residence is central to understanding single mothers' economic well-being, the green line, the green bar. I didn't talk about it here, but in another paper we've also shown that this is true for health. Among single mothers, those co-residing with parents report better levels of higher levels of health, better health. I've showed that living arrangements themselves are of little relevance for understanding trends in poverty over time, but rather that the rise in single parenthood accounts for almost all of the rise in poverty, at least among mothers, and at least in the period we're looking at. So again, this is what I would hope you take away from this in terms of understanding what's going on with respect to poverty. Very briefly, what don't we know? The most important thing to take away from this slide is the font size is a lot smaller than the what do we know, what have we learned slide. So there's a lot that we don't know. We don't know anything. This is just poverty. So this question was a beautiful question about other kinds of resources, in-kind transfers or shared resources, shared housing resources. We haven't looked at that. We can't with these data. We could look at near poverty, so a different definition of economic disadvantage. We could look at need, another kind of measure that people look at to measure economic deprivation. We haven't looked at health, mental or physical health in these kinds of studies. I mentioned that one study that we did earlier, very limited data, would like to do that again. We don't know that very well. Most importantly, if you think about one of the reasons we really care about this is we care about it because all of these measures of economic deprivation and other measures of stress among single parents have been linked to less favorable outcomes for children, the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. We know nothing, zero, about this in Japan, to my understanding, and this would be a fantastically important step if we were able to do something like this. I'm been asked to give a talk on this in the summer, so I will be working on this shortly, and maybe there'll be another opportunity to come back and share that later. I hope so. So I mentioned that. And one of the things that, going back to the question earlier, we don't really know what co-residence provides. We've made a really just sort of extreme, simplistic assumption that when people live together, they pool all their income and everybody gets a piece of the pie without any sort of discrimination among family members. That may be wrong. We also don't know anything about shared resources, housing, food, other kinds of things. We don't know anything about support. There's a huge body of research on the extent to which intergenerational co-residence at older ages is a source, with adult children, is a source of instrumental, emotional, financial support. We don't know anything about that with respect to single mothers. This would be huge. Childcare. There's also a body of literature on married mothers that suggests that co-residence with older parents is a major predictor of women's labor force participation via childcare. We don't know anything about childcare for single mothers, the extent to which they're able to access childcare via co-residence. So there's a whole range of questions, I think, that remain unanswered and I think that are really important for understanding disadvantage among this group in Japan. So that's where I will wrap things up. A minute late. I'm more than happy to answer any questions or take the discussion in whatever way you want. So thanks very much for listening.